Hello, and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line. We start out in the Kupiansk direction, where we see that the Russian forces have managed to recapture the section of the front line after a Ukrainian attack previously this month, where they managed to cut off the road in between the northern and southern parts. And with this counterattack, the Russian forces managed to regain these positions that the Ukrainians managed to take from the Russian forces, and as such they were able to get closer to the village of Ivanivka, which is fairly isolated from other villages, but it has this backup village here, Stepova Novoselivka, which allows the Ukrainian forces to have some forward positions here, and this makes it more difficult for the Russian forces to actually launch attacks towards the village, as there will always be reinforcements and fire support from the previous village. There's also fighting here by Kislivka and Kotlyarivka. However, the Russian forces have not yet managed to gain a foothold within any of them. We then move on to the north of Bakhmut, where the Russian forces have managed to gain a bridgehead across the Vasyukivka River here in the north of Sakoivansety. So we're seeing that the Russian forces have now managed to actually cut this road here between Vasyukivka and Fedorivka. We'll likely see further Russian operations here to gain control over the road completely and cut off the connection between the Soledar and Vasyukivka direction. And with that, we actually see that it is a continuation of the offensive operations here to the northeast of Vesele and between Vesele and Rostolivka. With this, we'll likely see further operations in the north as well as in the west, as the Russian forces continue offensive operations in the Bakhmut region, as we see with all of the advancements they've made so far in this month. As for the Orlivka direction, we see that the Russian forces yet again managed to recapture some positions the Russian forces were pushed back from, where the Ukrainian forces managed to gain control over the waste hills here to the west of Orlivka, and now the Russian forces managed to counter those offensive operations by the Ukrainian forces and regain control over these areas. So with this, we see that the Russian forces are actually trying to regain control over the areas where the Ukrainian forces have taken control of. As earlier this month, we actually had more Ukrainian advancements, and now it's down to just 3. Then we have the latest developments in the Avdiivka direction, where the Russian forces managed to advance north of Stepove, capturing this forest line, and with this they are now closer to gaining control over Stepove. The Ukrainian forces still have a presence within the outskirts of the village and the forest lines besides them, but that's about it, as the Russian forces continuously pressure these Ukrainian forces within the village. So the fighting here is similar to that of the Ivanivka area to the north, where there's the village of Stepove and then there's the village of Berdishi, where Stepove is much smaller, but it has direct fire support from Berdishi, which allows them to hold on to these positions even without a presence there. It is also in close proximity to the city of Avdiivka and other positions here far from the front, which allows them to have heavy artillery support in this direction compared to other areas. So with this, it is clearly very difficult for the Russian forces to advance in this direction, as they're constantly under artillery fire and a lot of FPV drones from the Ukrainian side launching at their positions, as we've seen countless videos of. But at the same time, we still see the Russian forces advancing, despite all of this, as they use their own artillery, even FPV drones, etc., to counter those Ukrainian defensive actions. We then move on to developments further south in the direction of Marinka, where the Russian forces managed to advance slightly here in the northern parts of the city, where they've actually managed to get closer to complete full 100% control over the city, as Marinka itself also encompasses this area here to the north. Despite it not being part of the city proper, it is still part of the city itself. Therefore, we see that the Russian forces continue these operations here in the north as they try to gain full control over the city, and they continuously pressure Ukrainian forces in the area to allow them to spread out from the city itself and launch operations in other directions, such as Bobieda to the south in the direction of Novomikhailivka, and so on. All of these operations to try and gain further control and exploit the capture of Marinka. These advances were recorded and geolocated by Deep State Map, which shows this geolocation right here. As for the Robotini direction, we have this satellite image here, which shows the utter destruction on the village, as after a lot of fighting in this direction, we actually see that with the continuous fighting, there also comes consequences of those fightings. And as we see, there's constant artillery craters everywhere. This shows how much fighting has taken place within the village and around it, both to the northeast and to the eastern parts of it. And all of these add up to all of the destruction we've seen. We can even see the trenches built ahead of the forest lines. As such, we see that there's a lot of fighting by those trenches as well. At the very far east, there's also one, as the Russian forces had a lot of fortifications in this area, which the Ukrainians had to break through to gain control of it. Also, something very important to mention is taking a look at these fortifications. We can see all of them were built ahead of a forest line. This is actually strategically built by the Russian forces, because when the Ukrainian forces tried to advance, they had to face off against these trenches, which overlooked a field. But now with the Russian counterattacks, they actually don't have clear vision of the Russian forces, as there are the forest lines in between the Russian positions and the trenches. So the Russians have an advantage when they counterattack compared to when the Russians were first attacked by the Ukrainian forces in the Zaporizhia offensive. So with this, we actually see that these trenches are the reversed situation of Klishchiivka, where the Ukrainians have a significant advantage when they were counterattacking and regaining control over Klishchiivka, as they had the reverse situation. But now that the Russians have the reverse situation, it is not that difficult compared to the first attack when the Russians try to recapture these trenches, as they have the cover of the forest lines and the lack of direct fire from Ukrainian forces due to the building of these trenches being in that manner. Therefore, we see that it is likely that the Ukrainian forces, similar to closer to Robotyne, you get the less trees are there because they've been completely burned down. Likely the Ukrainian forces intentionally get rid of the trees by the trenches to allow them better fire control and direct fire options in this direction. So with all of this information, how do we get articles such as this one that has the headline, Russia has lost 87% of troops it had prior to the start of the Ukraine war, according to US intelligence assessment? So let's research and find out what exactly are they talking about. Russia has lost a staggering 87% of the total number of active duty ground troops it had prior to launching its invasion of Ukraine, and 2/3 of its pre-invasion tanks. A source familiar with the classified US intelligence assessment provided to Congress told CNN. Of the 360,000 troops that made up Russia's pre-invasion ground force, including contract and conscript personnel, Russia has lost 315,000 on the battlefield. According to the assessment, 2,200 of 3,500 tanks have been lost. According to the assessment, 4,400 of 13,600 infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers have also been destroyed, a 32% loss rate. So let's ask this question: how many active soldiers does Russia actually have? Right now is the only way to find out how many troops they have, because the old information, for whatever reason, I have a hard time finding through Google. So let's just look at what they have right now. They claim that at the start of the war, the Russian forces had 360,000 troops. They've lost 350,000 troops. That would leave them with 45,000 troops. So Russia is holding the whole front line all throughout all of Ukraine with 45,000 troops. That is all they have available. We then see an estimation by Global Firepower. They claim this, again, 360,000 army personnel out of 830,000 active, of which 250,000 are Air Force, 155,000 are Navy. This raises the question: if they only have 360,000 army personnel and they've lost 315,000, then how are they holding the whole front line with 45,000? We have this website, Visit Ukraine, where they claim that Russia has 1.3 million active military personnel, of which Ukraine has 830,900 active soldiers. So a 500,000 more amount of soldiers than what Ukraine has. But this is significantly more than the 360,000 Global Firepower and CNN claims. We have this European parliamentary debate where they talk about all of this. And here they claim that the Russian forces have about 900,000 active soldiers. This is way less than the projected 1.3 million that the Russians are looking to have. But then we take numbers from Russia itself, because now we have taken numbers from outside of Russia. What does Russia say they have? Vladimir Putin says himself that the total number of army servicemen that the Russian armed forces should be increased by 170,000 throughout 2024 from the current strength, which is 1.3 million. So about 1.5 million is his plan for 2024. Then we have former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, the current deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council. He says that from January 1st to December 1st, 2023, the Russian army has recruited 452,000 soldiers who are now a part of the Russian active military. As such, if they had 900,000 prior to this year, they would now be at approximately 1.352 million people. If you exclude the losses, then it is less than that, and the 1.32 million is more accurate. But this raises the question, hypothetically speaking, if the Western estimates are right, which I don't believe they are because they are exaggerated clearly, if they are right, then Russia has recruited more soldiers through 2023 than what they have lost since February 2022. On top of that, they also have mobilized 300,000 troops with the partial mobilization. That is 752 additional soldiers, 752,000, compared to an approximate 315,000 losses by the Western analytics. As such, the Russian armed forces have grown by 437,000 soldiers, active soldiers, since the start of the war. And that explains how it's not 45,000 Russian soldiers holding the front line, but instead an additional 450,000 soldiers holding the front line, if these estimates are correct. These estimates include minor casualties as well, which is over half of these casualties. This would clearly mean that even with these estimates, the Russian forces haven't lost 87% of what they had prior to the offensive, prior to the invasion. They lost about 45% at most, if these estimates are correct. So this is a clear exaggeration and manipulation of statistics to gain more motivation, to gain, well, it's just propaganda. But that's about it for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.